So I don't know if you've noticed our cushions this year. I think we can all agree that this is Confucius right here that we started with. So I'll leave you with him, and then tomorrow we can talk about perhaps bell hooks, or maybe the robot back there. Anyhow, it is with great pleasure to introduce the final presentation. Prompted by the theme, School is a Factory, Tirdad, Zolghadr responds and reflects on our theme with schools and factories, his talk, Schools and Factories. Advanced degrees in the fields of the arts with programs such as curatorial and museum studies, art criticism, management, and administration have become ubiquitous. Their missions somehow commingle with education expansion and a market-driven professionalization. If we want to respond to the challenges and opportunities facing education today, and perhaps maybe even challenge or rethink or accept the idea of school as a factory, should we begin by dismantling established models and start afresh? Or can we imagine new models that critically embrace their purpose and power? Tirdad's lecture offers proposals to consider forms of organizing and reimagining approaches to education today. Tirdad is a curator, writer, and the artistic director of the Sommerakademie at Centrum Paul Klee in Bern and associate curator of KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. Please join me in welcoming Tirdad.
Thank you, Fauz. Thank you to the whole team. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for sticking it out. I'll be speaking around 15 minutes. I'll keep it as short as possible. So the conference brief, there was something which I believe many would see as provocative, would see as indicating some kind of a worst case scenario, comparing schools to factories. You think assembly lines and so on, and I wanted to try and strip it of any possible irony and to see whether a factory could be seen as a good object within the context of this conversation, and I think that resonates with some of the things that were being said during the course of the afternoon. And this talk is indeed indebted to thinkers like Victoria, like Marion von Osten, to pedagogical efforts of certain collectives such as Block.Space, and to conversations with the Forum Fellows here at Art Dubai 2017 and 18 particularly. So at first glance, the explosion of BFAs, MFAs, artist PhDs, semi-formal setups, auto-didactic experiments may seem like a big, colorful explosion of chaos. And you saw a certain degree of variety within this very room this afternoon. Traces of all kinds of para-educational mentalities. My hypothesis is that throughout all this multiplicity, what you see is a persistent investment in the expansion of a singular discourse, a singular market, and a singular infrastructure, which we call contemporary art. That's my hypothetical point of departure, and my wager is that you're all too exhausted to disagree with me. You don't need the white cube anymore to recognize the tenor, the smell, the moral economy, the temporality, the social ecology of contemporary art. A hidden curriculum teaches us what matters and who matters. In other words, we already have a factory on our hands for better and or for worse. The only question is how to make use of it. If you prefer to turn back the clock, back to something more small scale, more personal, then of course you must smash the machines immediately. And some do, many actually, do talk the talk of the decelerative and the marginal and the poor image. Few actually walk it. So I sit on juries, and very often there's someone who says this is also professionalized, this is also automatic, and why don't we get that satanic Potter shaman guy from Isfahan. Break it up a little bit. And then you say, well, you know, sure, why don't you take him for your BFA program? And then they go, it's just thinking out loud. And so that's the, yeah. On the other hand, if you're happy with reproducing the art world one generation at a time, then you can kick back and relax, because these conditions of production that I'm trying to describe here are doing a great job for you. The system attracts amazing brains, teenage brains, tween brains, as it is, and you have absolutely nothing to worry about. The third option is that perhaps you wish to tackle the agenda of art altogether and harness the factory for more important ends. And this is where this kind of hyper-automated model has much to offer. To be clear, a factory can be many things. It can be worker-owned, it can be exploitative, it can be green, it can be toxic. What you do have as a common ground that defines the ideal type of factory is the automation, the scalability, the efficiency, the depersonalization, and a certain disenchantment. This is what I'd like to focus on, which I would argue can make a factory floor be a promising theoretical picture for art education today. Consider scalability. It's happening already. Scalability is what the art world is really, really good at. It reproduces itself at staggering scales, at staggering speeds. It's a multinational platform with immense planetary capacities. And this is not a bad thing nor a good thing per se. It's simply a political opportunity, just as it is a pedagogical or a financial one. And automation plays a huge role here. I mean this in a metaphorical sense. The surgical reproducibility of our protocols, art world protocols, the magical ability these protocols have to breed and multiply like bots. But I also mean automation in a very literal sense. Automation as new technology. The spread of the art field would be unthinkable without the internet. And then you have ideas such as open source technologies and distributed ledger technologies, which have even more to offer in terms of how to make this global reach more equitable, more humane, more sustainable. It's challenging stuff, and I hesitate to talk about it in public, but what I can say I've learned from conversations around cryptocurrency and blockchain and so on, is that we have to revisit efficiency. In contemporary art, we contrast efficiency with creative misunderstandings, with inspiration, with the romance of potlatch, with laissez-faire and intellectualized self-indulgence. And I think that we have to think about efficiency as a result of careful self-organization in the aim of redistribution and sustainability. And that's, I think, the key lesson the blockchain has to offer these days. That efficiency is not about soulless machinery and unfeeling hierarchy and hire and fire. I would say this is a fundamental misunderstanding. If that was the case, if that's what efficiency is about, then the art world would be the most efficient place in the world. Our working models are thoroughly comparable, and most teaching staff are worse off than Uber drivers. There are few benefits, few contracts, and if you don't show up, you're not paid. In many, many, many institutional settings, this is the case, especially the progressive ones, ironically. All this hiring and firing within the art world means starting from zero again and again and again and again. And this is great for networking and spreading your reach in terms of human resources, but it's very bad for pedagogy, it's very bad for time management, and it's very bad for building loyalty, productivity, and an inspired sense of ownership and solidarity among your teaching team. It's also bad for teacher training, which we don't particularly value very much within the field anyway. In 15 years of teaching, I've never gotten serious feedback from a colleague. This is not because they're lazy, it's because we don't create these opportunities for each other. Instead, again, we assume teachers are inspirational. We assume that they can pluck pedagogy out of their backsides, that they are there to shock and awe. If you had more method in the equation, you could actually begin to build something intellectually more accumulative, more sustainable. Think of the way we reinvent the wheel every time we touch on an exciting new topic. Oh my God, I did gentrification last year. This year I'm going to do Reza Abdo. Victoria Ivanova once made the point of an increased need for specialization, a very articulate point. Instead of favorite topics of the day organizing your seminars and syllabi, they should organize a good decade of your career. This is a completely exotic proposition within our field, in others, not so much. Once you begin to accumulate knowledge, it's only then that you realize how amnesiac, and this might sound snarky, but also how arrogant our brand of self-imposed amateurism really is. So today's art school is not a place of efficiency on any level, and the biggest scandal of inefficiency here is that of our job market. The glut model, which prescribes that about 5% of our graduates, at least in Europe and America, make a living from art. This is not particularly efficient. It's the most perversely wasteful use of people's early adulthood. The field needs to shrink because dog-eat-dog is not a solution. Within art schools, this means that we need to be less mythifying with our art educational promises. We need to make it okay to leave. If you can de-glamorize joining the art world, then you can de-dramatize leaving it. If you disenchant the art field as a place of inspirational promise and as a place of individual achievement, then you can start to institutionally ensure that if someone leaves, it's just a professional choice. It's not a personal failure, and in the best case, I'm thinking of the US, it's not a financial disaster either, perhaps the UK as well. So we're on to my second point here, and the others will be much shorter, I promise you. After scalability, automation / efficiency, how do you disenchant? You disenchant by, as I just suggested, by framing contemporary art as a workplace, not a city of dreams, by introducing the machinery of the schooling institution into the seminar room, not as something to think about critically, but as something that is your co-responsibility as a student. Schools could even, I know this is weird terrain here, but I think that schools can and should make fundraising an intellectual activity. They can make their place within global value chains a banality to be addressed, not a tragedy to be critiqued. You disenchant by clarifying your mission statements. Most mission statements of art schools imply that art is enough. Art is a good thing. We're really good at art, so you being here is a good thing, clearly. So art remains a critical virtue in and of itself. This is why you often hear, now more than ever, we need drawing, painting, poetry, studios as free spaces for reflection. Why a drawing is any more important or interesting than a law or a union escapes me. A factory, by contrast, is there for a reason. It embodies a very clearly stated case for the monetization of a given aim. It doesn't assume that more macaroni or bathroom tiles will make for a better world per se. The question came up earlier, what can we learn from Bauhaus educationally? I think that the key thing is the why. That Bauhaus very aggressively asked the question of why are we doing this stuff in the first place? And this has kind of been lost during the course of the professionalization of our field and the repercussions for education. So this, in turn, brings me to my last point this evening, depersonalization. What can depersonalization be in an art school context? It can be learning to spot the difference between what is interesting and what is important. It can mean moving from a given individual self-exploration, self-expression, self-interest to group responsibility and collective empowerment. I mean, we all do our readings of Black Mountain and of the Situationists and now probably of Ruan Grupa. But then we go back to working alone as a kind of default condition to which we compare those collective modes of thinking. And what I'm proposing here is learning how to tackle infrastructural tasks in smarter ways, pooling ideas. This is very sort of or it resonates with what Victoria was saying earlier in her video address. Learning what dividing labor means, and ultimately, if a school can make a systematic investment in this type of thing, this might allow the alumna to take themselves more seriously as a collective body, as a tribal affiliation, beyond ironic terms such as CCS Mafia. So it should be clear by now that this talk, and I'm slowly going to conclude, is not about worker militancy on the factory floor of the art educational complex. We have to be realistic. We cannot expect today's art schools to be the new Bauhaus. We cannot expect them to be a site where we seize the means of production. After all, it's not even a site where we agree on fundamentals such as war and peace. I've written elsewhere about teaching for 5 years in the US without ever mentioning Iraq or Afghanistan. And even here in the region, I don't think we'd agree if we started talking about Syria or Yemen. But perhaps in a very long-term meandering kind of way, perhaps this kind of machinic reorganization around a new and more transparent set of priorities, depersonalized, disenchanted, automated, this might eventually, possibly gradually, kickstart an appetite for something more sustainable, more equitable, and more realistic than what we're dealing with now. Thank you.
Did you drop the mic, but very quietly? We have a little bit. Does anyone have any? Because we intentionally. The only point of inviting Tirdad ever is that he will piss someone off, but in a really articulate way. Are there any questions at the back there, please? Keep the questions short, incisive. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. This was great. As someone who's in a graduate program right now, it's kind of like thinking about that. But I'm just trying to bring up 2 points, perhaps theoretically speaking. So one, I've been thinking about someone like Barbara Hammer, right, who sort of had, who recently, of course, passed away, and one of her works, like her whole work is looking at what does it mean to die, right, and kind of not exist in that way, and kind of thinking that to like suicide or sort of failure, and kind of leaving as also like a form of death from kind of the world, right? So like a conceptual death. So I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit more about that, and even like the Jack Halberstam proposal of like the queer art of failure as also like sort of a radical act, right, within sort of this very market capitalist kind of structure. And if you could sort of perhaps make those connections, if you have been thinking along those lines, and how would you think of those proposals within this kind of market and production?
I have yet to see, without claiming to be an expert on the trope in and of itself, including the examples that you named, I have yet to see a scenario or the description of a case which did not, on some level, introduce a touch of melancholy or tristesse royale into the conversation as soon as it's about leaving the art field, at least, and it's very much akin to someone who it's a bit like if you say you're no longer active within the art field, the sense of personalized failure is extremely hard to exorcise, and I think that the way to tackle that is not by focusing on some kind of a demystification of the narratives of exit, but more about what it means to join this thing in the first place. And the signal effect of the arts right now is such that it can only it can only draw in those, and we have to be honest and self-critical about this as to why we started out in this field in the first place. But it draws those who feel that they have some kind of a unique contribution to make, who think that they have some kind of unique contribution to make. I was young too once, and so which. I mean, that comes with a certain number of problems, one of which is that if you wind up leaving, that means that you were, what does that mean? And so the direction I'm pointing, and I think it's kind of, it's about a de-glamorization of the field, which there's one economist that I keep mentioning, who I think is very didactic in a helpful way, called Hans Abing, Dutch economist who wrote a book called Why Are Artists Poor? I think that's a really helpful reference in this context.
Thank you. Barbara, please, can we just wait for the microphone, just for the recording, please?
Thank you very much. I thought it was really exciting and provocative and interesting. But you said it has to be a question. So the only thing you pointed out to where you showed some light in, what was positive was you mentioned that the Bauhaus started with the why. I don't find the why in your talk. Why to do this then? Even if you make it so efficient, you take out all the viruses that you are describing out of the system, there's still the why question in a way for me. We had the same question with the laboratorium. I thought at the end we had to ask the question of why. And maybe that will help us to have more sincere reasons to be involved in this, beyond juvenile excitement.
No, I appreciate that. I think that it was probably a failure of the talk to evacuate this touch of, or let's say, the sound of cynicism. I actually did not mean to be cynical, and I would genuinely subscribe to an art school that is trying to be efficient along the lines that I was describing, that is invested in depersonalization. I think that there is even, collective work on infrastructural issues is a mindfuck, to be sure, but I think that there is also pleasure in learning these processes and learning, and then creativity can become, and fun for that matter, can become a means to an end, not an end in itself. With disenchantment, that's the tricky part, which has a kind of, because the enchantment of the art world and the glamour of the art world right now is its primary sort of selling point. So if you disenchant that, you suddenly have to find some other fuel to keep the engines running and to keep the leverage that it has at present. So that's something you have to put more thought into. But the other levels, I generally meant them as good things.
Last question, and then we have to wrap it up. To bring it back to yourself, Tirdad, I mean, you've been teaching for how long now? 15, 16 years. Would it be fair to say that whilst you may, you may well have had various forms of disenchantment with the way in which the art world has evolved and progressed over that period of time, does your disenfranchisement extend to teaching to the extent where you would ever consider stop teaching? Because it seems to me one of the things that you've done many things. We've also worked together at Bidoon. There's been writing, there's been fiction, there's been curating of biennials, etc. But it seems that the teaching has run consistently like a spine through all these various activities. And at different times, it seems you've been active more in some things other than others, perhaps. But somehow the teaching is constant. Could you talk about that in relation to, both disenfranchisement, but also the factory idea? Because school or factory, we then tend to think of the student as a kind of automaton within that Fordist process. But of course, many institutions that become heavily bureaucratized, that become heavily dictated by, kind of state ideology, the teacher is as much of an automaton as the student may be as well.
So I think that I've been very privileged and lucky in my teaching career to have been in places where there is a certain space within the seminar room where you can then you can go in directions which might be this one or any other one really. The tricky thing about that is that there's a temptation to depoliticize that seminar room precisely in the way that I've been critiquing here, because you intuitively then see the superstructure as this bureaucratized space that you're then subverting from within in your little niche. And it's only been a few years, I think, where I can honestly say of my own teaching, like without critiquing the art field at large, that I think that there's a certain transparency of criteria and a method which slowly is a matter of reskilling in this direction. And what I would most enjoy is to then find a school which does not just offer you, you know, room 24B within which you have a semester to try out these crazy ideas with your students, and shields you from the Bologna process with technocratic tricks of the trade, but that actually would be able to implement these criteria officially in its mission statement and as an unapologetic sort of, you know, declaration. That would be something which would be, I think, immensely exciting, not just for me, but for the likes of Victoria. And I think right now there are quite a few practitioners very invested in art education who have an appetite for this kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much. We have run out of time. Will you please join me in thanking Tirdad Zolghadr?